Hello and welcome to Trail Buddy. I'm Mark. Today we're going to go over some of the basic adjustments that you're going to run into when you get your bike all put together. We've got a couple rides under our belt, and what we're going to do for our first adjustments and our shakedown and what we're going to look for. But it's also a good idea to get a manual of some brand or some kind, because even though this is an aftermarket motor, a lot of they really copy these motors really close. So anything in here is it applies to the motor that we have in this bike. So in theory, the carburetor adjustment stuff, same that's in here. The turns might be slightly different. All of our body adjustments is going to be the similar in here. And then the wire would be a little bit different. So I would always recommend you kind of get one of these books if you only have one bike, and put some of those instructions in here that came with the wiring harness, so that way you have a reference. And if you've made any notes, like I did when I put together my headlight bucket, I just kind of wrote down different things on what color went into the OEM connections. So I think what we'll first start with here is we'll get into the clutch adjustment. Now, out of the box, these motors are really pretty good. So what I'll do is I'll show you where we can adjust it and how to adjust it. Okay, we're all set up here to get this cover open, and I grabbed my largest screwdriver, got it in here, put my weight all to it, and it's still super tight. So we've got our little hammer impact here, which this is a must if you're rebuilding the original engines and or working on anything with Phillips, because it is so easy to wallow these things out and just make a mess. So what we're going to do is we'll grab this. Now there's a if you haven't used these tools before, there's a right and so righty tighty, lefty loosey. Same thing with this. And how I check that is I'll put it on the tabletop and you put a little pressure onto it and it'll turn. So now I got it set to where it's going to turn loose. So what we're going to do is we're going to hold this good and tight, and we'll give it a good smack on the end. All right, we got it loose. And again. There we go. Now, learn from my mistake. When you're holding this guy, do not put the web of your hand over top of it. That hurts really bad. We'll dig into this, get the cover off. So this procedure here would be very similar to an ice bear. I think they have a cover that is very close to this, or any other clone for that matter. So here we go. So what we're seeing here is inside the engine, it's grabbing and pushing on the centrifugal clutch inside here. So on the outside, we've got a jam nut, and on the inside, we have our actual adjuster. So I'm not going to mess with this one right now because it's in really good working condition. And what we would do is I would grab my open end socket, and I would grab a flathead screwdriver, and I would untighten this and then hold this. So if it's loose or not working quite right, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to take this flathead boss or protrusion, whatever we really want to call it, and we're going to hold this nut so it's loose, and we're going to take it and we're going to turn counterclockwise until we start feeling resistance. Then we're going to stop, and then we're going to turn it back maybe 1/8 of a turn, 1/4 of a turn at the most, and we're going to hold it right there, and we're going to tighten this jam nut right back up. So that's how you would adjust this if you feel like you're getting any slippage or slipping in with your centrifugal clutch. Now this, I haven't really adjusted them a ton on these aftermarket motors. I've done it a lot on the OEM. But if you feel any slipping, this is where you would make those adjustments. We'll put it back together. On to the next part. All right, I got the cover back on. Make sure we get those really tight so they don't rattle off. Now, if you were looking at an original motor, there wouldn't be a cover right here. That's all exposed. It's kind of like dished in so it doesn't hit with your foot. But that would be the difference between an aftermarket transmission and an original. So we've done our break-in cycle on this motor a couple times, and my son's been out there just really riding it and using it to its fullest. So there's a lot of things that we got to go over after we've done our first couple good rides. And one of them is we really want to be able to check our oil here. So this is kind of rudimentary, but it is the most important thing with this motor, because without oil, we've got no more motor. All right, so we're going to check this guy. So just make sure your O-ring is still here. It's good on top of our little dipstick / oil filler cap. And we don't have any dirt. Now, it's really important before you even take this guy out, get rid of any dirt around it. This is super clean, so we don't have to worry about it. But let's say you've been riding out in the sand or mud and having a really good time. Clean this off. It's a good practice when you ever work on anything with the motorcycles, is to keep sand, dust, dirt from getting inside here. So we're going to check our oil. I'm going to bring it in, maybe give it a little turn. Set it for a sec. Now we've got our bike here. It's really super level. We're on our center stand. And checking our oil. So I'm about right in the middle. I'm maybe a little bit low. So when we first put the motor in, we put fresh new oil in it. And I think I probably roughly had it maybe a little bit higher. So as everything kind of seats in, the oil works its way into all of the components and parts and pieces. So after that, the oil level usually does drop just a hair. But we're good right here. We are right in the center. So put this guy back in and move on to the next adjustment. Moving on to the rear of the motorcycle, we're going to double check our brake adjustment here. So almost all the time, when you put new brake pads on, they kind of wear in and everything kind of seats. So most often when we're riding, this needs to be adjusted quite a bit more. So I think the first thing we'll do is we'll adjust our pedal here to where we're barely pushing that, but we don't want to hear it dragging. So I can hear a little bit, I can hear the chain moving, the bearings, but I don't hear it hitting the drum, the shoes. So this isn't horrible, but what we're going to do is we're going to push this in with my thumb, and I'm going to turn this a couple turns. I like to do that. The rear adjustment nut has kind of like a fish mouth to it. If you just sit there and turn it, you're really wearing that guy out. So one, I'd like to push it forward till it locks up, and then I like to leave a little bit of wiggle. So that way I know I'm adjusted fairly well. So we'll listen to it. Okay, we're not rubbing yet, and we are barely using the pedal. So on this one, we converted the H-frame to a kind of a semi-automatic setup. So we put in our rear brake cable setup so we could go ahead and fill the hole that we had on the top with our aftermarket handlebars that match the original. So here, what we need to do is when we cycle that lever on the top, it's got a little boss here that pushes on the arm. So I'll get over here. And this is set really, really well yet. So on the rear of the bike, I like to set these up. So the adjustment that you would do if it was not is right here. There is a threaded barrel that the cable goes through in a jam nut. So for that, if you wanted to tighten it up, you would loosen this and then turn that threaded rod clockwise. That would be clockwise. We're going to move that out until we don't get any wiggle here. On with our secondary brake lever, I guess is the right way to call it. And this one's all set up good to go. And I like to set my rear so I can really lock up that tire. The front, there's some debate. It's kind of personal preference, but some people like to set up the front to the adjustment to where if you get full brake, it doesn't quite lock up. Now that's great if you're on the road, maybe you're in a gravel, marbly spot. My personal preference is I like to set that brake and I personally meter locking that thing up or not locking on my own ABS system. But you can do that. And then the procedure for the front is almost identical. There'll be a little adjustment knob here. And again, after our first couple rides, we're going to let everything seat in. And you just adjust it here with the lever in the front and do that again. Now, we're also going to be looking at, as we're checking it out after our first really good rides, I want to go through and make sure all my fasteners are not loosening up. I noticed while I was checking my brake that my rear axle is just slightly loose. So another important reason to just double check and do a shakedown run and get that thing back on the lift to double check everything out so you don't have a bad day. So we'll move over to the other side and we will check out our chain and we'll adjust that. Okay, now checking out our chain. This was tight, relatively tight when we started. And if these stretch and kind of seat in, it's gonna do it like the first few rides. This is another thing you want to check out, leaves, after riding it a little bit, is we're gonna check this guy. So we've got way too much movement here. You're looking for, you want about 1 inch of slack. And like this I can tell because it's hitting the swing arm. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna loosen up our chain adjusters here, both sides, and then we're gonna loosen the axle and we will adjust this back. Now I think we can get it, but if you really gotta push that guy back, you're gonna have to take another little link out. But I don't think we're gonna be that way right now. So we'll get this loose. I already kind of started this before we set the camera up. The tools that you're going to need for this guy, this is an original rear axle and a nut, is you're going to need a 10mm wrench for our adjusters here, a Phillips screwdriver that's big enough to go through the axle here. That'll hold it as you loosen the nut on the other side. And what we have on here on the axle is a 19mm for the other side. Okay. And there we go. Well, that could have been a little tighter, but that is why we are checking on our shakedown. So we've got this guy, we've got 2 nuts on here. That really works the best. You throw another secondary jam nut to hold that adjustment nut on. Okay, so now what we're going to do is our chain adjusters have a little mark in it and a tick, and they've got corresponding marks in the rear swing arm and this elongated hole. So we're going to take this guy and we're going to adjust it back until as they're equal. So that way, when we stop, we're going to want about 1 inch of play here. So I'm pulling this guy back, and I got my axle loose. Don't ever try to do this with the axle tight because you'll just strip out your chain adjusters. So I'm going to bring this about halfway between the last tick marks. All right, and as I'm adjusting, I'm feeling and I'm moving this chain up and down. You can take some more. So now we're getting to the end of the adjustment here. So we're almost. All right, that is plenty tight. So we're pulling it up and down, and I'm getting about 1 inch of travel. So what I do next is, before I do anything else with these jam nuts, I am going to go ahead and tighten this axle. Okay, so I've got this sock down, and while what is happening and can happen is I adjusted my brake rod before I adjusted my chain. So as I pull this back, the lever is a fixed position, and now it's taking that lever on the other side and it's pulling the brakes closed. So what I need to do is loosen that to match where my axle is in position. So what some people, if you haven't done this before, is they go to tighten this guy, after they move it back, and they're like, oh my gosh, my brakes are locked up because I tightened my axle. No, it's not because you tighten your axle. It's because when you move this guy back and you've got your brakes adjusted nice and tight so you barely have to move them, now you've got, essentially the brake is on. All right, we got that good and tight. Got that out. Still got our inch of slack, roughly. And okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and set these guys. I've got my axle tight. I'm going to get this snug. Okay, and I will set my jam nut. Okay, I'll check my brake rod. All right, now we're reset. So another thing, or the thing that quite often gets overlooked when you're focused on the chain, is double check your rear brake. So I've got this set. I've got my jam nuts tight, my axle's tight. I'm still have an inch of slack, and we are good to go. Now we are over to our carburetor, and we'll double check how our settings are. So as I was riding this bike, it was really dialed in, like out of the box, which is really kind of nice. But the way that you check that, if you're not really hearing sputtering or missing or anything like that, and you just kind of want to lightly dial it in, which we'll do here because it's working pretty good as it's set up with this engine. So we'll just check our spark plug and we'll read our spark plug, and we will see where we're at in terms of rich or lean. Now this has been ridden a bunch of times. Heat up, cool down, ridden for maybe a half hour or so. So we've got some good usage on this spark plug. We will see where we're at. So we are pretty, I won't say pretty, but we are on the sooty side. So what that means is we are just a hair rich. So what you really want to see here, it's going to be black-ish, but it should be almost a little more brown. So to fix this or adjust it, we're going to go over to that carburetor and make our light adjustments on our air fuel mixture screw. So this would be the time where it'd be nice to have yourself like an extra plug. So you can kind of keep these in a box, but it's good to, after you make this adjustment, to put a brand new fresh plug in. Make sure it's the same heat in terms of the part number on the side. And that way you can have a fresh plug to read after you've done that adjustment. Ride it around roughly about the same amount of time, and then pull that out again and read your plug here to double check. So I don't have one on me just a second, so I'm going to throw this one back in for the video, because this takes a little bit, and we're talking like fine tuning right now. So that spark plug itself was on the black sooty side, but it wasn't like full on black sooty. So for tightening this, you be careful. So what I did is I brought it in till it's flush and snug, we'll call it, and then I'm just going to give it just a slight turn to compress the washer on our spark plug. So we'll make sure we get this in. And reinstalling this, you want to make sure you get it on. I like to put it till I feel it hit or touch the inside, and then listen. And you want to hear a good crisp snap. So that way we know we're on the back side of that electrode on the spark plug. We're going to make sure that we don't have our coil wire anywhere near our exhaust. And we'll set up on the other side and show you the air-fuel mixture adjustments. On this carb here, on our left side, as I'm sitting on the bike, has all of our adjustments. So this is a really nice carb. Some of them have the air-fuel mixture screw underneath. I think that's like a Mikuni, call it a Mikuni replica, has that. So this guy here is really, really easy to adjust. So we've got two different adjustments here on the left side of the carburetor. So let's go over the first one here that's in line with our slide. This guy is our idle adjustment screw. So as we adjust this in, brings the idle up. As we adjust that out, it brings the idle down. So setting this, you don't want to monkey with this until this engine is at good operating temperature. So that way you have the characteristics of it when you're going down the road. So our bike is cold, so we're not going to adjust that right now. But that is the procedure for adjusting this. So I like to set this so that way, like with the semi-automatic, if you have it adjusted too high, it's going to be kind of like just trying to engage that clutch and move forward in first gear. So you want this low, you want a nice, maybe almost before you think that it's going to stumble or hesitate, but not much lower than that. So that is a good setting on your idle. Now for our air fuel mixture screw here, this is where we would make that adjustment. So after reading our carburetor, we know that we're on the rich side. So for that, this is where we would make the adjustment. So what we've got here is we've got our little screwdriver here, and a little goes a long way with this. So as we adjust this, we're gonna, because we're rich, we're gonna go in, or excuse me, we're gonna go out because we want to get a little bit less fuel. So we've got our little screwdriver. I'm going to find my screw here. And since we're doing fine adjustments, I'll probably just go to a, what are we going to call it? Maybe a quarter turn here. And we'll see what that, we're going to put a fresh plug in it and we'll see what that reads later. But this one is pretty amazing. Right out of the box, it was running perfect. Now, we do work hard with our manufacturer to make sure we've got a good carburetor that matches the CCs of the motor. So this is a different carburetor. Let's say if you were getting a 140, so they're slightly bigger. This one's a little smaller. Kind of the best of both worlds. You get the most power, fuel ratio into this motor and still have, you know, good duration in terms of how much MPG you're getting. So that is this guy. And another thing I didn't really talk about here is this is our choke. So this carburetor here, it's kind of deceiving because you can pull it out a little bit and it's not choke on. What you need to do is pull it out until you hear a good snap. So that's choke on. Typically you got to do that, especially if it's colder, but almost, and these are really good to a Honda. I don't think I've ever had a Honda, for the most part, that wasn't cold-blooded. Even my CRs and my CBs, boy, it could take a while. So they did good copying Honda for these aftermarket motors. But here's our choke, and where our air fuel or our filter here is good and clean. We're making sure, I'm gonna just kind of look, make sure we don't have any kinks in our throttle cable, and we are good there. One detail we didn't really go over in depth was with our new motor and our original bike, how we selected our gear ratio for our sprocket combination. So my go-to, my personal preference is a 16-35. So we've got our motors come with a 16 out of the box, and we selected a 35 for the rear. So what that gets me is that's kind of like right in the middle. If I were going to be doing a lot of street riding with this guy, I would probably get the biggest sprocket I could put on the front. Now, 125 Now with these bikes, you'll never run out of motor horsepower, you'll run out of gear. I've got an S65 that's got a bigger tire diameter on it. And with the 125 that I had in that one earlier, I could actually run out of horsepower going 60, 65. And say I'm going uphill, I'd have to downshift. For these smaller bikes, smaller diameter tire, we'll call it, it's not necessarily an issue. But let's say if I was going to be doing a lot of off-road, like in the woods and the trails and not necessarily getting on road at all, I'd want to go probably a little bit bigger in the rear to that way kind of slow her down, and it puts that gear ratio lower. So in the end of the day, you want to think about, do I want to shift a lot down low and I don't have a lot of top end, or do I want to sacrifice my first gear being a little taller, not as much power in the sweet spot, trying to drive slow, or you're sacrificing that to go fast. So it's something to think about when you're selecting your sprocket combinations. Now, if you really want to play with it a bit, it's a good idea to maybe get kind of a couple different sprocket combinations so you can play with what you want to do kind of as a personal preference. But simplistically, if you're really just bombing around the road, or the yard, this is a pretty decent combination. Again, I got a 16 on the motor, come stock, and I selected a 35 for the rear. So that's a little bit of a detail on getting your sprocket combination and how you want to select that. Now on the rear, checking our tire pressure, we need to check that periodically, but in the rear, we want to set this guy with our stock diameter tires about 18 to 20 in the rear, and about 15 to 18 in the front. So that's checking that periodically, and that gives us the best overall. I mean, that's actually, I think, the specs in the book. So filling your tires with air, that's where you want to be. Our final piece of adjustment we're going to go over on this video here is our rear brake light switch. So we've got it connected properly by a little spring here. Kind of takes up a little bit of a discrepancy or different tolerances. So how you adjust this is there's a little plastic holding nut here, and you can adjust this clockwise to pull that up to where this is pulling, or you can adjust it down the other direction counterclockwise. So let's say, oh my gosh, my brake is stuck on. This is where we would look, right here. Or I hit the brake and my rear, and that typically happens after you do any adjustments here in the rear brake drum. So if you adjust it up to where you're barely moving your pedal and you got your setting where you like it, this here, and sometimes you have to give yourself just a little more play in your lever here, so that way the switch isn't like right on the almost, we'll call it, right? So it's barely, I got this set pretty good, so it's moving decent. So what I'll do is I'll get the key on, and we've got our running light working, and our brake is actually adjusted pretty good. So as this pulls down, it's going to meet or make the contact points in here to turn your tail light on. So that covers the adjustment here for our rear brake light switch. So that's got us for the video tonight. Now please, these are very important things to do, especially checking your axles, checking your engine bolts, checking any other fasteners that if they were to come loose, you were going to have a really bad day or experience. When you put, it even happens to me with the amount of bikes I even put together, where one thing that I try to do quite a bit is like, and when I was apprenticing for tool and die stuff, is they always instilled in me is to never put a fastener in unless you're gonna tighten it, because it's so easy to look at it and like, oh, well, that looks like it's in, and that can really kind of screw stuff up. So you can't always do that, but that's something nice to get in the habit to. So check that, check all your adjustments. Again, another thing to look at is make sure your gas cap is set good, make sure it's got a good breather, make sure that little rubber part of, this is a plastic gas tank here, but make sure the little rubber diaphragm is not all rotted. Sometimes if the rubber sits for long periods of time and then also you start introducing gas to it, it can deteriorate, especially if you're using some of the really, really old stuff. Check that, go over your adjustments, and you should have a pretty good enjoyment. You want to make the hobby as fun as you can without having any kind of major oopsies. So that concludes this. Hope you found all this stuff usable, and it's kind of introductory stuff, I guess you could say, for some people, but for some just getting into it, these are good tips and tricks to get into good practice for. So again, check us out on mytrailbuddy.com because we want to get a little bit less fuel. Is that right? I can't remember.